Network Automation Nerds podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Network Automation Nerds podcast, a podcast about network automation, network engineering, Python, and a whole lot of technology topics. I'm your host, Eric Cho. Today on the show, I'm very excited to be talking to Jason Belk, Cisco NSO Developer Evangelist. Jason and I will be talking about his personal journey into network automation, network engineering, NSO APIs, NSO sandboxes, and learning labs, and a lot of exciting stuff from the NSO landscape. So let's dive right in. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we've been kind of conversed as you're very active on Twitter and you're the developer evangelist, right? Yeah. So you're always on social media, but it's finally nice to, meet you over the screen and also, talking to you over podcasts.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been in this current role for about 2 years. And even before that, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point. NSO has been a big part of my network automation journey and career development as a person discovering what it means to do network automation. And I'm really excited to talk about all the different things we have planned.
Yeah, for sure. But, before we dive into Cisco, NSO, and network automation, sure. I'm always interested in how you got started with network engineering, what's your background in network automation. So can you tell us a little bit about how you get started in technology overall?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say for networking specifically, in my undergraduate did computer science, but it's funny because in my interview for my internship at Cisco, they asked me, would you consider yourself a strong coder? And that's a pretty honest question to have when you're a teenager, young 20s, trying to get your first job in big tech.
Yeah.
And the interviewer was very perceptive and very open. And she said, no, this has nothing to do with whether you're getting the job or not. We're just trying to figure out what area of Cisco we want to place you in. And I told her honestly, even though I'm computer science, I'm not good at coding. That's not my bread and butter. It's hard for me. Yeah. I have to work at it. And I'd say that's one of the things that's kind of defined my career in a good way. Like most people would see that weakness as a weakness, and I see it as a strength because I use that to kind of propel me into other directions. So instead of focusing on the things they were teaching me in classes, which were good foundational concepts, the networking class I took really, I think, sparked my interest in saying, wow, I don't need to worry about C++ arrays and pointers and memory allocation. I mean, there's definitely details to worry about networking, but I feel like that just made a lot of sense to me when I took the networking class. I'm like, this is, for at least my mind, I love optimizing things. I like trying to, if I'm driving somewhere in the city, I don't usually take the scenic route, So I'm doing OSPF in my mind even when I'm driving around.
You're like, man, that sounds like a DR to me. And, let's establish adjacency and a relationship with that neighborhood.
and so when I discovered networking, I'm like, this is an entire industry of people who like, technology, like learning how to make technology impact your life in a positive way.
Right.
But are doing it in a way that uses existing constructs, existing protocols, existing vendor hardware or open source hardware and software to accomplish those goals. And that's what really sparked my interest. I ended up, when I joined Cisco, because I'd answered that question that way, they rightfully placed me in kind of like a hybrid marketing technical group, which talked about how Cisco used its own products internally, and I learned a lot in that role, but it opened the door for me to transfer internally. I got my CCNA after being there for a couple of years, and I had made some friends in the networking team, got a feel for kind of what their day-to-day looked like. I thought it was so cool that they were in the terminal. Like you think about these hackers and stuff when you're a kid, you're like, oh man, you're in the terminal. You must really know what you're doing. And so that was like my mind, as a young career person, like that'd be so cool if one day I could know how to use a terminal and accomplish things.
Oh and man, so you were in the right place, right? That's all you do. You're at Cisco. You live in the CLI and the terminal.
Yeah, little did I know how fateful that desire would be. And so moving into that networking role, it was a great opportunity for me to learn from Cisco, because we were in Cisco IT. So we were managing Cisco's internal campus and branch networks. So they have 600 offices all the way from San Jose to across the globe in remote locations for sales offices. Of course, you have tax sites, you have partner sites, you have manufacturing sites. There are a lot of different environments that you have to work with. And you also have 25, 30 years worth of invested, I guess, design work and iterative, I'd say almost archaeology in terms of the technology that is going on within that network in a good way, but also it's a challenge.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it would totally be funny. I mean, because when you say Cisco IT, right, or Cisco networking, it would be like so funny. It's like something goes down, like WAN link goes down, and it's like, how many network engineers does it take to get that link back on? It's like, does anybody know about MPLS in this office?
we had a wide spectrum of people and experience, but it is funny that like you are the networking company working on networking hardware, and I think that also provided a lot of valuable experience to our customers, so that like when we had challenges, when we had struggles, we were able to like relate to our customers and then help provide that feedback to the business units or the different units that need to know what need to be fixed. It definitely made what we were working with homogenized, and that we were all working with Cisco hardware. But even within Cisco, you have differences between Cat 4510, 3850, 3750, ASR 1K. There's a lot of different variables you still have to work with, even just within Cisco hardware.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So was that your first job? Like, because I know you've been Cisco for a long, you were at Cisco for a long time, then you left for a little bit and then came back to it. So was that, starting from internship and just all the way up to different orgs and different positions?
I did some game testing in electronic arts in college.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, in terms of my first job out of college, that was it. So I was an intern, I was converted to full-time hire, and I was at Cisco, I think, for 7-8 years. And then in that process, doing network engineering, implementations, operations, and then automation, and then learning automation myself, and then helping teach others to kind of lead an automation initiative within the organization, and then eventually leaving, going network to code, and then coming back to Cisco.
So when was this? When did you start that kind of network automation journey? Because I mean, Cisco wasn't always so bullish on network automation, right? As you know.
Yeah, when I started, like 1PK was just being kind of known to not be something that was being invested in as a Cisco STK, we'll just say. Those of you who have heard the phrase 1PK, I know Jason Edelman can definitely relate that.
Yeah. Like that was the second time I heard about it this week, and precisely from the same person you mentioned. So, and I was like, I totally forgot about 1PK. Like for years and years, I haven't heard about I haven't heard about that term, and now it's like a second time. It's like, oh yeah, 1PK was the bomb. They were like, it's being pushed around for like, this is your ultimate automation tool. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, this is the 2015, 2016 timeframe. So I started out learning Kirk Byers' NetMiko course, and he has a really great content and just an all-around great guy. And that helped me because, like I said, even though I had taken these computer science courses, like it wasn't something that I could just pick up and run with. So his courses really helped refresh my memory and get me redisciplined into thinking about, okay, let's think about our tasks and programmatically and think about the tools we have to use, syntax. And even just, I think, setting up a development environment is a learning curve that a lot of people who've been doing it for a while take for granted. Like that's something that I know took me a good amount of time, not just to say, hey, you install Python, but okay, how does my environment connect to my company's internal, jump host, to our internal labs that are, isolated to, so all these different little things that seem trivial, but actually add up to be a decent amount of work. And that was one of the things I did to help our team, is that I took all these different settings and tools and basically created like a virtual image snapshot, and then shared that with my coworkers. Because originally I had made like a long wiki to say, hey, this is how you set up your stuff. But eventually people just didn't read it all. I'm like, it's just easier if we just like codify this, and then you can be up and running. I found that to be pretty useful for myself and others.
Right. So as opposed to like apt-get install 20 different tools, you just say Vagrant up and bam, there it is.
I had a Vagrant file, and then eventually, as I got more used to Ansible, using Ansible to provision, some of the different pieces. But I think that's what really helps within an organization. People adopt, some of those initial barriers to entry being removed. Because I think there are a lot of people, they've already got their secure CRT set up. They've got, maybe a few bash scripts or Perl scripts that they can access on a jump host. But I think for people who are just getting started network automation, Like obviously the DevNet sandboxes and other resources out there are great, but I think they still require an assumption that you're using their environment. And I know that for a lot of network engineers, like, okay, this somewhat relates to what I'm working with, but I really want to work with my own lab. And, exactly. I really want to be able to then also eventually touch production, not changing production initially, but yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
No, so I hear what you're saying, and you mentioned Kirk's class, and I do want to give him props for that as well. I think Kirk's was the first person who actually put Python in a network engineering context, right? So it really helped. Like you said, people don't want to just learn plain Python. They want to be able to leverage Python to do something that help them. And so I took Kirk's class as well, and it was kind of eye opening, where instead of just looking at plain Python, print hello world, I'm actually be able to change the device configuration, help myself, help my team. And it sounded like you took that one step further and say, let's create a whole environment up, and let's make it easy to onboard.
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. So that's an iteration over time. But it definitely pretty early on, other people were interested, management was interested in having other people adopt it. So it definitely helped. I'd say your book, I have it back there, Mastering Python Networking, was also an early and great resource.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Your camera. So if you haven't read it, you can read the first edition of Mastering Python Networking from 2017.
Nice. Oh, I thank you for that little marketing piece. Speaking of developer evangelist, right? That's your big man. Way to work that in. So smooth.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of my passions is reducing the friction, toil, and barrier to entry for getting started and progressing in learning journeys. And so a lot of that is just connecting the right people to the right resources for what they're trying to do. And I wouldn't suggest someone to look at CCIE books getting started. You start with CCNA, and just like that for network automation, there's a lot of good resources to get started with, but there's also ones that you should probably wait later on. I really appreciate the conversation I had with John on Django and Flask, and I know that's a huge topic for a lot of developers, and I would say for people getting started, that's good to keep in the back of your mind, but just worry about the hello world stuff and moving on from there.
Yeah, and it's not a knock on Django or some of the other tool sets, right? Like it is really just going from day 1 to day 10, right? Like somebody else is at day 99, but it's great to have aspirations to be there. But at the same time, we want to have a roadmap. And I like what you're saying about just finding the right tool and connecting the right people to it. That's how I feel. Essentially, what I do for whatever writing blogs or interviewing you, for example, is just really to expose these great tools, great people, great content. And people it's like a buffet, right? Like some people like sushi, some people like pasta. So take whatever you need, but the point is to move forward and moving the right trajectory.
For sure.
So you mentioned you're a developer evangelist, and just from let me pull up the webpage, because this is pretty awesome. You're the face of NSO Dev Center. You're everywhere in Network Field Day, and a lot of presentation. You're very active on Twitter. So what does a developer evangelist do? What are the day-to-day like for you?
Yeah, so I'd say this webpage is an example of 2 years worth of work, basically my entire time. I'm not working exclusively on this webpage. That was about 6 months working with one of the DevNet user design teams. But I'd say the content that fills out those pages. So we have, Postman collection I created. We have DevNet sandbox that I worked with the sandbox team to set up the requirements for. We have podcasts, interviews. I mean, I say that the public-facing stuff is what people probably think of. You have the DevNet Snack Minute. You have other YouTube videos and conference talks that people usually think of for developer evangelists. But I'd say the behind-the-scenes stuff is really what the day-to-day mostly looks like, at least for me. And just thinking proactively as an educator, what are the things about my product or Cisco's products in general that would help reduce that friction to them getting the value out of it and making their job easier. At least for me, I created probably a half dozen what I call learn by doing examples. that I put on the code exchange. So stuff like that, where I set goals for myself based on when I see the actual perceived gaps in our public documentation, public examples, and then just chipping away at it over time. And then also leveraging the resources of other people within the organization, because there are a lot of great engineers within the NSO organization and DevNet more broadly, and realizing that I don't personally need to create every single piece of content that is associated with NSO. There are a lot of neat examples or proof of concepts that we can leverage and then showcase and share with other people as well.
Got it. So
no, I'll just say one last thing. It's kind of a mixture of both internal and external advocacy. So like externally, we're helping customers, but I'd say internally, we're also, as Cisco is a very large company, we have salespeople who need to be educated about what our product does and how to position it and what's good for it and what are challenges. You have services CX who are also implementing our products. You have other product teams who are trying to maybe integrate with our product or have features. So there's a lot of also, I'd say, internal advocacy where you're being the technical translator between the understanding of your product and then the broader organizations outside of the other teams.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, like you said, usually when people think about evangelizing or just customer advocacy, it's always about the external stuff, the YouTube videos, the training videos that you do. But at the same time, it's you're serving both internal and external customer, and they actually have very different requirements at times. So it's must be pretty challenging. I mean, you have the same website probably, but it has to service both internal and external customers.
Yeah, and I think the big part is understanding that people who are doing their day job focused on what they're doing don't necessarily have the needs of all the different stakeholders that need to be addressed. So if you have a PM who's focusing on a certain feature set, maybe for the product, they're not aware of the new user who is getting started because they can't figure out how to navigate the Linux terminal and install the right packages or something. So like, even if people think things are okay, it's also important for you to be proactively thinking of the needs of others and having those needs be voiced back to the people who are just focused on their own kind of sphere of domain, and then so that might help enlighten them and also help push the rest of what the product's supposed to be doing forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. I mean, I worked as an SE before, and I think the most successful SEs, I not saying I was, but the most successful SEs is kind of have that, kind of read the room and kind of, kind of guess customers' mind and one step ahead of them. So I think it's great that you're helping the SE team or the CX team at Cisco to do that. It's kind of one step ahead because you've talked to more customer, know what their challenges are. And you mentioned a couple of times the friction that you are very mindful about the frictions of the onboarding, the first 5 minutes of that experience. So that's great. I'm super glad you're doing this because somebody has to. I'm glad you.
And a lot of it comes from my own personal experience. When I tried to learn NSO, when I was, so I'd learned Python with Kirk Byers. And then one of the other guys on my team was playing around with this NSO thing, and he was so excited about it. I was like, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of this." And this is like in 2016, 2017, I think.
Right.
And he's like, "Oh, it was from this acquisition a few years ago from Sweden, and it's really cool because these particular engineers were probably, I'd say, more on the software side of within our networking team. So they didn't have CCNAs, but they were focused on more of the automation tasks.
Right.
And that's why they were really excited about NSO, because I think one of the things that excites people who have a strong software background about the product is that it does create a proper and good abstraction for your network devices, and so you don't have to worry about syntactical variations. Even on Cisco iOS, between iOS releases, you can have different issues come up for the same command. And so, and all that to say is, like, they exposed me to it. There wasn't very much training material out there publicly, or even internally at the time. A lot of the way NSO grew was with a high touch engagement model where you had an overlay sales team who was basically mentor the potential customers or salespeople and walk them through how to use it.
Yeah.
And so, like myself, I learned from these other people next to me who had figured it out themselves. And I was just like, so fascinated with how it worked because I'd been working with NetMiko for a little bit. I'd been working with Ansible starting at that time as well, but at that time Ansible doesn't have all the bells and whistles it has now. Like you still had to provide like your separate credentials because the networking modules didn't work quite the same as all the compute modules. So for me, like I learned from these folks, and like I got so excited about the potential myself and what we could do for the team. We actually created like an NSO kind of learning module. Like we created our own training for our own team after we'd had some successful projects with it. With that small team, we wanted to expand it out to other teams. And that's what kind of got me into like the educator space, the helping teach other people about network automation stuff, because I saw the value myself and also in my coworkers and how they were just so excited about unlocking that value. And that actually kind of took that content as my resume to network to code. When I interviewed there, I was like, hey, I've already created basically this course. And I actually became, when I was at network to code after that, an instructor teaching Ansible and Python and stuff like that to network engineers.
Yeah. So for people who are not super familiar with NSO, which stands for Network Service Orchestration, can you just tell us a little bit of what it is? Because it's a tall order, right? Like if I go on the website, it says NSO supports the process of validating, implementation, and abstracting your network configs and network services. So how, like, just the overview of what NSO is and what does it do?
Yeah, so NSO Network Services Orchestrator, at its heart and soul, it's a configuration management development platform. So we're not, even though it can touch operational data of show interfaces or show IP route, that's not as much what it works with. It's primarily with configuring your network devices, going from where you are today to where you want to be and maintaining that. And the heart and soul of it is with the configuration database, the CDB.
Okay.
So it has an XML based in-memory database that basically means you can interact with it quickly, and all the data is structured in a way that can be easily converted to JSON or YAML if you want to do those things. And that database includes both the application configuration of, okay, what settings do we have for NSO itself, as well as all of the network configuration for all your networking devices. So you have a local snapshot of every single device in your network, even ones that don't support APIs. So if you have an old CAT 3750 that's never going to get upgraded, never going to get netconf, restconf, and stuff like that, it has NSO has what we call network element drivers. So NEDs, in short, that are basically, I'm pointing here on the bottom, say we have the CDB here, and you have NEDs, and you have network devices, and these are the software translation between. It reads in the running configuration for all those devices, parses it for you using Yang data models, and then stores that parsed configuration into the local database. And then once you have that snapshot, so you say sync from, it logs into all the devices that you told it to, pulls in and parses the network configuration. And then it looks the same, so you see all the running configuration in standard native format, but you can also then suddenly now do pipe display XML, pipe display JSON for your Nexus, for your iOS, for your other vendor devices, where previously you'd have to log into each device and then possibly use Genie or other things to kind of parse that here and there. But the product's been around for 10 years, so they've parsed tons and tons. I'd say it's basically built to demand, but over the years they've built a pretty comprehensive already parsed data model of all the networking devices. So they support, I think, over 200 different platforms. So if it's something that's in production of a company of reasonable size, NSO has a way to talk to it and a way to model that data. So once you have that parsed snapshot, you can then make changes locally, and it will calculate what commands would need to be sent to have that sent to the device. So kind of a declarative state where you say, I want the state to have these interfaces and these particular IP addresses, and if they're already there, it's not going to push anything. But if they're not there, then it push the minimal number of commands. It translates from that parsed local database into the right number of commands you need to send.
So you mentioned Ansible, and Ansible kind of grew from a more procedural mindset in their playbook into more declarative. And how is that different or the same with NSO? Because it sounded like they're more declarative, the NSO is.
Yeah. So I'd say the Ansible iOS config modules are definitely procedural. where you're saying, I want to send these set of lines of config, and then boom, it sends them one by one.
Yeah.
They have the idempotent check the running config to see if those lines are missing, but sometimes lines have interdependencies on each other that are more complicated than just whether they're present or not.
Right.
And so since NSO has that data model validation, like, oh, we have an access list under this interface, you know, where is it referenced on the actual access list? And then it would throw that error even before you do a commit try run. So I'd say that's one of the main differences in my mind is NSO is able to have that stateful knowledge of what's actually on the network, and then have a model-driven understanding of how the configuration relates to each other on its dependencies. And so when you're actually pushing configuration, they both, for simple examples, might look the same. Like, oh, I'm going to push an interface. I'm going to push an interface. You know, it looks the same, but I'd say for more complex examples, and then for examples that have a lot of dependencies on each other, there's a significant difference. And also NSO, because it's generating the commands on the fly based on data model representation, it also can generate the rollback commands for you automatically, where for Ansible, you'd have to build your own backup plan, or do like a configure, or just do a configure replace the previous version of that running config.
Yeah.
So I'd say, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah. So it sounded like NSO has a better overall understanding of your network. So for things you could, you know, if you're just doing it on one single device, it's probably the same. But if you're touching multiple devices, like you're provisioning like an MPLS circuit or whatnot, which is everything has to happen at the same time in the right order. Otherwise, you know, nothing's going to work. Then something that has a higher level of abstraction, it sounded like it's a better way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And also it has the concept, the S for NSO Services. It has like a whole set of functionality around what we call NSO Services, where you can create custom packages and extend the application. So you can say, I want to create my iOS interface package, or just my interface package for all my device types. So it extends the data model of the application itself. And so anytime you add a new package, it adds new functionality across all the APIs. So the REST API, the GUI, the CLI, Python API, all that now becomes available for the package you just added. And within that package, it has the data model, which defines how that API is extended. So you can say, which basically defines the inputs of your service. You can say, I want to give a name to my service instances. So we're deploying this to, we'll say, our campus in San Jose, and then, you know, that way in the future, if I want to remove that service instance, it would remove all the configuration just associated with the config on that one service. So the service includes the input parameters that you can customize, the configuration templates, and then any additional Python or Java code you wouldn't have executed before and after the changes.
So if I were to overlay, so the package sounds like it's a streamlined process from northbound to your southbound, and you know, you kind of work way through that. But NSO in general, if you were to go from just the very top, so you know, the northbound, so to speak. So you already mentioned, you know, there's some kind of abstraction. There's a data model, and you have a database in the middle, in-memory database. You have the network drivers that you talk to. And then, you know, then the driver will be responsible for, you know, parsing data, talking API, or screen scraping. Am I missing any piece? Because it seems like it's there, but I wonder if there's more pieces in there.
No, I think that covers all the major features in my mind. Is you have the programmatic way to expose the functionality of the northbound, like you're talking about it. You have the data itself in the CDB. And then you have, within that data of the CDB, you're either interacting with it through device by device level, so they call that the device manager, or device groups, or in a service by service level. So this is my L3 VPN services and my service instance. So and those services are kind of the blueprints, and then you create service instances that have, you know, particular variable inputs, and then all of that is then talked to in the network devices through those network element drivers, just like you were saying.
Got it. So it seems like that's what the fundamental differences of NSO between other say orchestration or automation tools like your DNA Center, SD-WAN, Meraki, ACI. So these are actually kind of domain specific.
Yeah.
And I would say, I don't know, just for my basic understanding of them, it seems like they take a device by device approach. So you're actually, the human being is actually
Yeah.
responsible for making sure all the like the system level is working, but on the device level they could take care of all the boring tasks of actually pushing the commands down.
I would say one other major difference is that NSO, as it comes out of the box, does not have any built-in use cases.
Okay.
So when you install it, it has no NEDs originally. I mean, you install the NEDs. I mean, that's not a huge process. We have an installation process. It's pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And then it has an empty CDB. So like I'd say in a comparison to like DNA Center, where DNA Center out of the box, you spin it up and you have PNP, you have a template designer, you have Fabric, you have all these different series of features that are, I think, correlated to specific use cases.
Yeah.
Where NSO does not have an opinion on what types of devices are in your network, what use cases you want to do, and that makes it kind of difficult when we're talking to salespeople or people who are just figuring out like, okay, does this do ACLs? Like, yes. Okay, does it do? And you just go down the list of all the different configurations.
Right.
Yes, it does. I mean, as long as it's configuration that we can configure on a device and we can abstract that into a service, which is pretty much almost every configuration. NSO can accomplish those goals. I'm not saying it's the right tool for every job, but at least from a capability standpoint, it's very flexible. And that's why when I talked about it originally, I said it's a development platform. So it's a platform product, and more so than like we're giving you the Swiss Army knife of these 6 different use cases. Right. I think it appeals to a different type of organization. So some organization to have predefined use cases built for them, so that way they can plug it in and then just focus on, integrating with everything else and assuming that architectural, design. But then there are other organizations that I think want to have more of a say in what their architecture looks like, or they have a lot of different customization options, or people who just like building it themselves. So I'd say NSO definitely should appeal to people who love building things themselves, but also don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we give you all the tools you need to build whatever you want and save all the time on all the boring stuff of, I'd say, the parts of network automation that most people don't enjoy in terms of indentation issues, parsing config, all this stuff, setting up SSH connections, timeouts, all this, even things that dealing with a nice abstraction like Nornir or Ansible or Napalm, you still run into. So I say that's one of the huge value adds. It's a build-it-yourself platform that can really enable a lot of neat organizational changes and also expose those services to outside stakeholders. Because, like I said, when you build these packages, it creates an extension to all the APIs, including the REST API. So you can say, okay, now that we have this L3 VPN service, we can now expose that to our ServiceNow application, and then it could initiate calls back and forth. And oftentimes NSO is paired with some type of, I'd say, service catalog application, workflow application. Ansible is also sometimes used to configure NSO because Ansible has NSO modules that we've contributed on there. And so use Ansible as basically a runbook where you say, okay, my first step, I want to have the WebEx Teams or Slack, be notified of a change. Step 2, let's call NSO and configure the service or make a few changes on the device. And then step 3, well, update Netbox, IPAM, or whatever you need to do. So Ansible is good at setting up those sequential steps and stitching together all those different business applications that really make network automation, I'd say, production grade. And then you have NSO just focus on the part that it's good at, which is configuring the actual network devices.
So it seems like NSO is a development platform, as you mentioned. So the learning curve is a little bit higher for people who get started. But once you learn it, the capability and the ceiling is a lot higher as well, right? So the learning curve is there. However, you won't hit that ceiling so quickly as in some other tools who are very domain driven and they cannot expand beyond what they know.
Yeah, and I'd say one other thing is that it's also been a well-proven platform. Like, it's used by the world's largest service providers at scales of hundreds of thousands of devices, with multiple vendors. across the globe. And so it's been proven in production to take care of business. But a lot of these stories, I mean, we do have customer success stories, but some of these stories can't be told because the service providers, it's their own, competitive advantage to have NSO set up in the way they have it and things like that. But I'd say the ceiling it also goes in a lot of different directions in terms of the ways it can scale out or scale down. And I'd say the learning curve also, I'd say it's also like a value curve, because like the learning curve, NSO has a CLI that mimics the iOS CLI, and you can use that to explore. And so you can do question mark, what's the next option? That helps me a ton. Tab complete. And so it has like, and then you can go to configure mode, conf, and then also it has what we call JStyle CLI for people who prefer to set things. So like for me, network engineer, that helped lower the learning curve a lot, because like when I was working with NetMiko or Ansible, like I was having to go, okay, set my stop and walk through the code and try to figure out where the error was. I mean, NSO still has debugging tools as well, but at least for just getting absolutely started and seeing how the application is structured. Having the CLI mimic an actual network CLI, I think was just a genius way to set up the application from the start. And then you can do show commands. So you can say show running config for router 3, and then it will show the running config, and you see pipe display JSON, and then it displays the JSON. So I think for me that helps lower the learning curve, but I'd say that's not enough value probably for people who are just getting started to buy the entire product to be able to do those minor things. I'd say that the value of, oh yeah, we definitely need to buy this starts coming in more when people realize, okay, now we can templatize our code and declare our config and abstract these services. And so that there's this gap, I would say, where people say, oh yeah, you can get started real easy, but I'd say it's the value, their perceived value of what they can return on that does require more of an investment and understanding of treating your network as code.
Yeah, I mean, you can't minimize, like, again, like you said, you can't minimize the onboarding experience, right? Like that's part of the comfort level for people who are just getting started. Because I remember talking to Big Switch folks, and they were like, yeah, in the beginning, right? They were just like, okay, here's your object, and here's your methods, and you write this into a function capsulation. But when you talk to a network engineer, they talk about config T, they talk about OSPF interface mode. And it wasn't until they started to, implement what you said was, the Big Switch fabric, where you could still do config T, the equivalent in Big Switch. You could do like show run for switch 3, router 4. That, starts to ease people's mind and allow them to have small wins. At least it does what they do today. But hey, look, after you've done whatever you could do, here's all the other cool things that you could be doing.
Yeah, and I'd say one thing that we've done recently, and part of my work, was to create a bunch of labs to help lower that learning curve.
Yeah,
where when you're building these services, the languages that it uses, like I said, is Python, but also when you're defining the data model, because NSO itself as an application uses Yang to define the application data model, which I think is confusing for myself and other people where we're getting started, and that they're like, oh, Yang netconf. Well, they always put together. It's like, you don't think of Yang and NSO. I think people who haven't used NSO understand how it works. It's a little bit, I'd say, confusing. But
sure.
So Yang is actually a skill that I've developed in using NSO that's been applicable now outside, because it's obviously used outside of NSO, and so I can read Yang a lot easier because I've been using it a lot in NSO. But the people who designed the NSO product were some of the founding members of the netconf Yang, IETF initiative, and so that they basically said, hey, we've created the standard, let's productize it more or less. And so they made conf-D, which was basically like creating netconf Yang embedded in network devices, so that they can basically have a reproducible way to expose netconf Yang to people without having to reinvent the wheel. And then after they've done that, then they say, okay, let's add in a way to configure other devices more than just adding it to a single device in the background. And so Yang is definitely one of the core knowledge pieces. And we've been building learning labs on DevNet that we recently released in September. So we have 3 new courses on Yang. They're on the Dev Center, which we showed earlier, that you can click and link into. And I'd say these are applicable especially for people interested in NSO, but also for people who are just more generally interested in Yang. There's not a ton of Yang content out there. And, learning it for NSO, we do have parts there that we say this is how it works with services, and this is how it works with, understanding the application. But I think that's a hidden resource. I hope it's not hidden for long that people would take advantage of. And we're just like, because me, when I was figuring out Yang, I was trying to read the IETF RFCs and like YouTube videos from like 2009, and like, so it was a lot of it was trial and error, and relying on other people. But I'm hoping with these resources, it will help up level the game of what's available for people just in getting started. And then I'd say one other resource that we're finishing up the editing right now and should be out in I'd say like early December is XML XPath labs for NSO. Because like I said, the internal database, the CDB, is stored in XML. And so the way those configuration templates are represented in your service packages when you're doing, even though the device on the other side might not be speaking XML, the way NSO ingests that information is in an XML format. And so these XML XPath courses help you understand what's going on there. If you want to do some advanced ninja stuff with XPath and create, connections and do calculations, you can do stuff like that. But at the very least, I mean, NSO, you can do, like I said, pipe display XML, so you don't actually have to handcraft XML yourself from these different devices, but at least will give you a working understanding. And I'd say that's maybe another resource for people who are working with other products that work with a lot of XML and XPath could probably take advantage of.
Oh, that's great, because I always forget to close my brackets, right? So, so it's like, oh, okay, and I always forget the different levels
or even like copy and pasting. Like you'll highlight and go up, and then you'll miss that bottom bracket. Not even just type, just in the pasting.
Exactly, and it's like disastrous once you miss that one. It's like you receive like hundreds of errors, and you're just like, oh, I just missed that little slash. But let's roll back a little bit, because I mean, Yang is still I would say probably a strange word to a lot of folks out there. I mean, myself included. I mean, I've worked with Yang a little bit, but I can't claim myself to work with Yang on a daily basis. So let's go back and say, what is Yang, and what is Yang used for in you mentioned how Yang is used for NSO, but just generalize, what is Yang model and what is it used for generally?
Sure. So I'd say at the simplest level, Yang is our data models. And if you don't, if you're like me and I didn't know what that meant when it was first told to me, I'll go into more detail. and so they're text files. You can go on GitHub. You can go through NSO and look at the Yang files actually for the application itself. So they have an extension .yang, and within those files, they describe what are the constraints of the inputs that you want to work with. So if you think about like an Ansible playbook, you're like, okay, we have certain parameter inputs on your modules for an Ansible playbook. So we want to have strings, we might want to have integers, we might want to have an IP address as an input. And if you have an invalid input, Ansible will likely not throw an error. It'll probably just pass it along, and then you'll get an error on the execution where it'll say, oh, no, sorry, that's invalid IP address.
Right.
And there are ways to include data model validation for Ansible, but this is just a simple example for that.
Sure.
And so Yang, these Yang files describe the constraints of the inputs. You see, I want to have my module have 3 inputs, and I want to have the first input be a string. I want to have the second input be an integer, and I want to have the third input be an IP address. And you're not saying anything about what the actual data is, which is I think is the thing that throws people for a loop a lot. It's like, wait, why would I write this down? So it's so that after you define these inputs, then you can have some other tool compile that model into a binary that can then be consumed by an application that can then validate those inputs for you in the background. And so taking that same example, you write a Yang file, you define those inputs, you compile the Yang file, and then you store it into an application that uses those constraints. That way, let's say Ansible playbook or an NSO instance, you type in an input and you push enter, it should check the Yang model data model, say, is this a string? Nope, it's an integer. Or is it a string with the following constraints of, let's say you can create regular expressions. You say, we're looking for a device name fitting the conformity of how our team works. We say, site code, 2 integers, dash, function dash, GW integer. And if it doesn't fit that particular format, then it's going to throw an error. So you can get really specific on the constraints that you want to have. And that helps codify, I'd say, like your design standards also if you're using Yang in that way, or just data modeling in general, because you can do data modeling in Django and other stuff like that. So it provides a useful framework to have these constructs, to have these, I would say tools, but like phrases that you can quickly describe and then reuse later on. So like within Yang, because it was a data modeling language defined explicitly for network engineers, because there are other data modeling languages out there. Like I said, Django has one, sort of Flask. Other ones have that where you're defining what are the inputs, what are the constraints. So the neat part about Yang is that you can reuse a lot of these regular expressions. You can import other people's Yang files to say, let's look at all the regex for a MAC address or IPv6 or stuff that you would just not want to reinvent the wheel for.
Right.
And so these Yang files are then used with NSO to validate the inputs for the particular functionalities, or in the case of netconf Yang or RESTconf, if you've ever, and it might be a good exercise for someone who hasn't done it before, to do a netconf call to a device that doesn't have Yang installed on the device. So you can do a netconf call to like a legacy device, because I think netconf is supported since like 14 dot something or 15. It's been supported a long time, but netconf Yang was not supported until 16.3, I think, in iOS.
Right.
So you could. I actually did this when I was just learning how to play with netconf. Is I opened up an SSH session. I did, port, was it 883 something?
Yeah, 883, I think. Yeah,
something like that. So and you say, and netconf has its own protocols of defining, hey, I want to say hello, and then give me a response. And so I said, hello, give me your running config, and it gave the entire running config in one XML bracket.
Nice.
Cool.
No structure, no nothing, or just like plain text. There you go.
Plain text. That I could have just logged on the device and then show running config and then written, some XML around it and done this. It would have been the same output.
Right.
And so that's my example of netconf without Yangs. So same call, you're then able to see every single item of the configuration split out into separate subnodes, submodules. And for those who've worked with JSON or YAML, it's basically saying, instead of having just one big string block, you're then going to have all these subtrees and sub pieces, and all of those also have all their inputs defined and constrained by those Yang models. So that gives all the structure to that data that your human eye, it looks the same on the device, but programmatically it allows you to configure, change, update, delete in a lot more granular fashion. So you don't have to parse down to the specific piece of the config you want. You can say, no, I want interface 3's IP address changed.
Yeah, so I think you touched on a point where a lot of people mention as their concern about Yang and data models in general, but Yang also for networking, is supportability. If somebody would come out and say all of the Cisco device eventually will support Yang model, or then I think there's no doubt, right? Like people are just going to go, this is just the way it's going to be. So we might as well start now. However, you see this uneven support, and fair or not, people have compared Yang to SNMP, right? There's like this small set of things that are very compatible with everybody, interface, for example, but there's also this whole bunch of other stuff that are enterprisey and specific to vendors. So I want to pick your brain a little bit about that aspect.
So I think that's a totally valid concern, and I think people should continue pushing vendors to not make the same mistakes they made with SNMP. So even though I work even though I work at a vendor, like that doesn't mean I don't have opinions too. Like I totally agree that that's I wouldn't say unacceptable, but I'd say it's realistic and sad. But I would also kind of bring up that the value that netconf Yang, RESTconf Yang has added is different and I'd say more valuable in certain ways than SNMP has.
Yeah.
Because at SNMP, people didn't really like working with it.
No, for
especially
sure.
Especially for configuring devices.
Oh, for
not
sure.
used very often, unless you're somebody who also likes using Emacs and getting really down in the nitty-gritty detail. And so for netconf, RESTconf, I'd say on the configuration side, it's not perfect because you're really dependent on the vendors to implement the underlying code that translates it from the API to the device actually being configured. Right. And that's not perfect. And I'd say, I think that's realistically just a matter of time where things are going to be incrementally improving. Like I wasn't around when SNMP was invented, and
Mhm.
but I can
Me
imagine.
neither. It's low in the tooth, that's for sure.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had similar issues at the start, and
Yeah.
I think the issues that we see are, I'd say, understandable in the sense that like you have different sets of needs for different customers, and you're trying to produce products that appeal to all of those needs at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where you have certain customers that want to have, I want to have completely vendor neutral configuration.
Sure.
I don't care if it's Cisco, Arista, HP. I just want to say, configure my interfaces, configure my routing. It shouldn't be that complicated. So you have some people like that, especially people, at large scale, who like to build their own stuff. They want to do open config, IETF, like Yang. And so you see, nice part of Yang is that you do have these vendor neutral ways of representing basic network configuration. But I'd say the tough part is then the implementation is hit or miss, if that always works. And then also IETF versus open config, has its own back and forth. And so I'd say realistically, a lot of people are going to do a little bit of this if they're really interested, but more realistically, they're going to do the vendor-based Yang models. And I'd say the benefit of using those is that then you're able to unlock and use all the features that you're probably paying for in the particular vendor, that they have their competitive advantage. Even something as simple as CDP. And so
CDP, that is proprietary, right?
Yeah, right? Cisco Discovery.
Yeah, sure. As opposed to LODP, but anyways.
Yeah. So or switch stacking. I don't know if that. Anyway, so the point being is like, people, if they're paying a premium dollar for certain features on their devices and they want to be able to use those features, I don't think it's realistic to have those features exposed in an open config kind of world. And so, you're going to need some type of vendor proprietary model that you can interact with programmatically. And I think we're still in the initial stages of that. Like, I could definitely see it taking another 10 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, before things are completely seamless. I'm not saying I know anything on the inside of Cisco, but just kind of my observation of the industry and how quickly IT moves and people adopt change, and like how long it takes for organizations to fix bugs and all that kind of stuff, especially when we're talking about multiple vendors kind of aligning themselves. Like when I started this journey, like in 2014, 2015, I'm doing automation starting 2015, 2016, like people at that time were even talking about, netconf Yang is going to replace the CLI and all this stuff. And it's been 5 years, and things have moved. I'd say they moved the ball forward from the goalpost to like the 20-yard line. But we have better tools. Like I know Cisco came out with a new Yang tool a couple months ago, and Juniper, they have NRE Labs that's done stuff, and Arista has their own pieces. So like everybody, I think, knows this is the future and are continuing to move things forward. But I think it's really not going to be, I'd say, widespread adoption until those hardware refreshes catch up with where the marketing promises have been for a long time. Because at least in my experience, like, it takes a while to swap out old hardware, and then oftentimes, unless you have complete uniformity, or you just kind of say, we're going to just silo off this old stuff and not worry about automation, just do everything on greenfield. Like, there's different ways to handle it, but I'd say just realistically as an industry, it's going to take us a long time to get to a point where this is completely uniform. And I mean, it's an exciting time until then. And I would say there's definitely still advantages to be taken before we get to that point, because we need to be pushing the vendors to help continue to make better tooling, better visibility, better troubleshooting. But we've definitely, I'd say, come a long ways even in the past 5 years.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I work for a vendor as well. So I think personally, I would definitely agree to the point where there's no way you could have complete uniformity. I don't care how much dollar you have, how big of a stick or carrots you have. You have to be able to provide vendors where a piece of area where they could shine and differentiate themselves. Otherwise, they're just not gonna support that tool. And I think for the most part, Ansible was successful because it does provide these extensions where the vendors could shine, and that's where we overlay that with the Yang model. Yes, you want to grow that piece where it's the common ground, but you also need to have this other area where the vendor could showcase their unique features and differentiate themselves. So it's always a balancing act, I think, and I agree 100% with what you said.
Yeah, and I think other products that are going to take advantage of NetConf Yang are going to help speed that along. So NSO is one of them. But I'm sure there'll be others, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see what the industry will unfurl, especially as you have streaming telemetry and other data points that provide a lot of additional value, but have their own baggage with it that you have to okay, now we need a time series database and do all this other stuff. But I think I'm excited to see what the startups, what the vendors, what the open source community thinks up. I mean, even seeing things like Scraply and Nornir, and I'm sure other projects at Merlin, pop up in recent years that when I started weren't even there. You had NetMiko and you had Napalm getting started, and then you had Ansible, and just seeing that people see needs in certain areas, like, oh yeah, I love this tool, but it doesn't do this thing, and it pushes the industry forward in a new and good direction.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, and in a way, you don't want to. You can't, as a practitioner, you can't follow that trend. You can't follow the adaptation of each vendor devices that closely. So in the meantime, use NSO, right? Like upgrade your NSO, and then all of a sudden 10 more devices and 10 more model could appear, and you could define your packages, your service, and all of that, which is a great lead-in for my next question, which is what are the multi-vendor support or supportability for NSO? I mean, obviously they have a leg up for all the Cisco flavor devices, but what about other vendors?
We have a slide that basically shows all the major vendors, and I'd say, like I said, if it's supported in production, people are using it. We probably have a production net for it, or we have a team that creates a proof of concept within, I think, a week or 2 weeks.
Okay.
And so I mean, Arista, Juniper, Nokia, Big Switch,
the usual hits,
the whole laundry list.
Yeah.
I would caveat that these these data models are built to order because we're only human, and basically as customers purchase, okay, we have these three, we have Juniper on the backbone, we have Arista in the data center, we have Cisco in the campus branch, and then okay, what hardware platforms do you have? I mean, stuff like those conversations happen initially, and then they say, okay, yeah, we have 9 out of 10 of that already, and we'll do the last one and build that up. But like I said, since NSO has been around for basically a decade, that initial conversation of do you have it, we need to build it, is now more of do you have it? Yes, usually. It's like esoteric platform, esoteric command. Even within iOS, when we were doing a .1x rollout within Cisco IT, we're like, oh, they don't have the .1x commands in NSO.
Oh, okay.
And so we went to the NSO BU and gave them the commands, and they
kind of important.
Yeah. And so stuff like that, I would say that's as far as I know, NSO might be one of the only, if not the only, product within Cisco that has, I'd say, the most complete multi-vendor support in a meaningful, I'd say, in a meaningful way, where it's not just like, oh, we have an SDK that you can kind of build your own adapter if you want to. It's like, no, we would, if you're paying for it, we will legitimately support. I mean, there's sometimes there's problems that are related to the vendor platform itself, and you have to open a ticket with Nokia or Arista and so on. But a lot of times, if it's just syntax and data model issues, the NSO team handles that on their own and opens those support tickets too.
I like that, in a meaningful way versus just like it's an SDK that anybody could download and open source, and so you're free to spend more time on it. But rather you're saying no, this is the same level of service. It's on par with whatever we support on Cisco with a Cisco label, and we'll take that from here.
And I even saw a conversation on Twitter recently. I think talking with Jeremy Schulman and some other people, customers of NSO, had chimed in, and someone asked that specific question, and one of the customers volunteered saying, "Hey, we really think that the non-Cisco devices that are connected to NSO have an equal opportunity, equal strength in being configured as this Cisco non-Cisco." And that's marketing you can't really pay for.
Right? Did you frame that tweet and put it as your desktop?
No, I mean that's what Jeremy. For, and that's one of the things that brought me back to Cisco and taking this product. Is I really believe in what it can do, what it has done, and people are like, oh, why isn't it more successful? And I'm like, well, one, because up until very recently we didn't have a lot of learning resources and ways to get started. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
high engagement, and we're but I'd say too, it's just like it is complicated enough, and that people just aren't going to naturally gravitate towards it, and also because the people who are using it the most are people who generally their competitive advantage is how they manage their network.
Yeah.
And so there's not as much fanfare about all the cool things that are happening with NSO. We do, like I said, we do have customer case studies, but I would say that those are two things that have kind of kept it behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But we've been doing more and more to try to say, hey, this is not just for service provider. No, we have large enterprise accounts. We have, federal sector, government accounts all over the world. And so it's really something that, like, for me, when I'm working with NSO, and it just makes me so happy. I don't know, because when I work with other networking tools, like I said, they all have their own trade-offs, but like being able to programmatically interface with any configuration with a standard API, it changes the way you think about things. Also, in talking about multi-vendor, where if you're like, okay, since we have NSO modeling the entire configuration, if we wanted to switch vendors, if we wanted to switch from Arista to Juniper, you have all that stuff modeled out for you, and NSO can translate it. So you can just say, okay, that's not just like a click button feature. It does take some effort to kind of translate it over, but still, because NSO is able to then translate the appropriate vendor commands for you, it's a lot easier to not be so vendor locked in on particular network device vendors.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it possible, right? Like you have a chance to get that done, and before it's like you have a chance because you could write your own code. Versus it's like you have a chance because somebody else could help you do it. And I think I'm excited about this tool too because typically in a current network engineering scenario, there's not a lot of thoughts about validation. There's not a lot of thoughts about source of truth. It's usually whatever's running in the network, that is it, right? And that's why it's such a mind shift for people to talk about modeling or what's the use case for that, because all of these are useful when you try to do things before you push into production. And so that's why it was a mindset shift. And like you said, when you have that tool, then you could really talk about CI/CD. You could really talk about infrastructure as code, as opposed to like, every time I talk about infrastructure as code, I have to use Amazon CloudFormation as an example, because that's the realistically, how you launch a virtual network and so on. But now with NSO, that is an actual like concrete product you could buy, and you could point to and say, now you could treat your infrastructure, multi-vendor infrastructure as code.
Yeah, and I'd say one of the huge time savers for that, and I've done different demos you can see on the Dev Center, but basically, and Hank has it as well, where since it has that programmatic snapshot of, I think on the first page for the Dev Center, might be, but anyway, so it's basically, I'd say that the neat part is that since it has that programmatic snapshot of the configuration, you can then just export that and convert it to YAML.
Okay.
Where if I was doing that with just a straight vendor CLI, you wouldn't have something. You'd have to build your own YAML files. So if you're working with Ansible, Nornir, without talking to NSO, you're usually, you can still do infrastructure as code. Definitely, like it's very common, very cool. Love all the people who are showing all that stuff, but oftentimes you're handcrafting these YAML files, or they're produced from a netbox source of truth and something like that. And the structure of that is just defined usually by your own imagination and its correlation to the Jinja 2 templates.
Right. And it's your own, right? Like you can't share it because it's so specific to your environment. And I'm sure, conforming to the standard will be the last thing on your mind when you're building the customized solution.
Yeah. And within NSO, you can either do infrastructure as code by just exporting, the different parts of the configuration that you want to change. So you can say, okay, let's export the interfaces as YAML, and then if you change a value of that YAML file, and then use Ansible to re-push it back up to NSO, it will then translate into the commands to make that change for you. I'd say the other side is you can do services through those YAML files as well. So like those service inputs, like you define like the site name and maybe a few other inputs, and then it would generate all the config for you. And And so I'd say that those are the two main ways that you can use NSO's infrastructure as code, either on device by device level, and then you're just swapping out the particular values for the parts of the configuration you want to change, and then push that to NSO or for the different service instances.
So, Jason, I'm sorry for my ignorance, but so if I don't have an NSO product, but I want to take advantage of some of these cool things that you've said, what are some of the ways to do it? Like, is there the open source version upstream for NSO, or what's the story?
So you can download NSO off DevNet for non-production use. So I'd say that's the main way. So there's no open source version of NSO.
Sure. There's no Fedora to the Red Hat.
Yeah. So there's no free way, because they've done a lot of work in terms of these parsing models and transactional integrity and all that stuff. But I would say you don't have to pay to get started. You can go on DevNet. We also have, I'd say, production grade NEDs on there for all the iOS platforms: ASA, XR, XC, Nexus. And so if you're just getting started, you can set up a lab, play around with it, for as long as you want, and say, hey, this is something that I'm seeing value in, I'm getting excited about. We can engage in sales and talk about what this looks in the long term. But and we also have, of course, the NSO sandbox, both an always on and reservable sandbox. So the always on, I'd say, more is for like just clicking around, maybe playing with the CLI, or using our Postman collection to see how the API is structured. And then you have the reservable sandbox, which has 2 instances of NSO. So you have a standalone server that just has NSO installed as what they call system install, which is kind of the production grade install. So it's a lockdown server. It's meant to kind of mimic what you do if you're working with an NSO in a real life scenario. And then there's also a development server. So that's just an Ubuntu, I think, box. And then NSO has what's called a local install, where basically it has all of the related packages and the database all in one directory that you can just easily see and manipulate and learn things. Versus the system install has it, in var opt and all these different places within the Linux system. So we have those 2 different installs. You have system and local, and then you're able to hopefully play around with the development one if you want to move on to the system install and play as well. We also have GitLab and Netbox installed in that sandbox. So if you wanted to build different scenarios with those as well.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Back to that all encapsulated tool, whereas one command versus 10 other, and it's undeterministic on like you said, the folders that it gets installed under, right?
Yep. And I'd say one last thing is that you can install NSO locally on your laptop. It in terms of an application, it only uses as much as you're asking it to. So if you install on your Linux-based system, so either a Mac or a Linux virtual machine, you can. I think it uses less than 2 gigabytes of memory. It uses a couple hundred megs of storage on your machine, and so you can take that DevNet free. Trial one, play around with your laptop. You don't have to worry about getting a whole local server set up. You can just play around with it from there as well.
Nice. Hey, I have more than 2 gig on my Raspberry Pi, so that should be like a little project, right? Running NSO on my Raspberry Pi.
I don't think it's compiled for ARM, but I did try putting I did try putting on a Raspberry Pi.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, no, nice. I tried putting ConfD, which is like an even smaller version of NSO on there, but yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll one day, that'll happen, but that'll be the day. So Jason, how, in your opinion, how can people get started with network automation? We talked about NSO. So that's one way to get started, right? Like you get the tool and you actually solve your own problem. But without NSO, how can people, in your opinion, get started with network automation?
I think in my experience, the important thing is having a tangible use case you're working towards. Because I worked with a lot of people who aspirationally wanted to work in network automation, but realistically it never happened year after year. And so I'd say if you really want to get into it, like if you're in a company that you're in a networking role, that's perfect. You can find something in your day job that's small enough that you could automate on a small enough scale. So like my first example was using NetMiko to run show clock to a lab device. And
nice.
And I worked my way up to eventually we created an iOS upgrade application.
Nice.
using NSO. And so I'd say have something tangible, even if it's very small, that is related to what you're working with, and something bigger that you're working towards that's really going to help you and your team. Yeah. While still being realistic of like the dependencies of like, okay, how much process is involved, you know, how security, and so try to pick something that's like doesn't have that many things dependent on it, or is not going to break, especially read only. So I'd say that that's the first thing is having something that you're working towards that's tangible and small. And then I'd say start talking to other people about what you're doing. So that's one thing that helped me a lot is coworkers are sitting next to me in the office at the time. I'd share with them what I was learning, even if it was just really simple stuff, and you know, got them excited about it too. And some of them started doing that network automation as well. So I'd say, of course, you have resources out there, the books we talked about. You have, you know, tons of stuff on DevNet as well as on other vendor websites and Pluralsight. And there's resources all over the place, but I'd say prioritize stuff that is interesting to you. And then over time, you'll continue to find more and more stuff, and your interests will help shape, you know, the direction that you want to go. Because there's a lot of people out there who recommend different things. And I'd say if those things excite you, go for it. But I'd say initially, you just need to get some momentum. You need to get some reps in, you know, just like any other skill. Like you have to get your practice in. It takes a lot of time. Like, there are a lot of nights and weekends in those first couple of years where I was staring at PDFs of documentation and just being like, I don't know why this error is not working. Like, and there were some errors that like now I could solve like that, and they took me, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks, you know, which is awkward when your job. I mean, I wasn't spending 9 to 5 every day, you know, just staring at a screen, wondering why I can't do work. Right. But like, it's hard, I think, first getting started, especially if you're in a role and you're dedicating some amount of your time to it. You have to have a management and leadership team that you can be open with and say, hey, I actually didn't produce anything this week, but I'm making progress. Even if I'm making code, like,
hey, look, I solved this error.
Yeah, no, it's like I've spent, what is it, Edison, you know, how many ways to find out how a light bulb doesn't work, to find out, and stuff like that, where I think it can be really disheartening. And I'd say just you need to power through it, and not and also do it through community, and you know, sharing your struggles. And there's some struggles that you don't need to spend a whole lot of time wasting your time on. Like, you should just ask someone for help. But there are other times where you don't have someone to ask for help. And so I'd say definitely now, with the advent of network automation being more broadly applicable, like, get yourself plugged into different communities and be vulnerable. Don't be afraid of not people thinking you don't know what you're doing, because like, perception over time will catch up to what you actually want to be. And I think most people generally don't judge you if you're like, oh, I'm stuck on this indentation YAML error, I can't figure it out, and someone points it out, and like, oh, now I figured it out.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's one of the things that people don't realize is even experienced developers, they get tripped up all the time. And that's why I love listening to podcasts of other people, like Django Chat, for example, just the other day. This is the core developer, like core maintainer for Django and Django REST framework. And he's talking about, you know, he gets tripped up every day, he learns new stuff. The difference is he's better at searching for answers on Google and Stack Overflow. So it's definitely, you know, something that we as network engineers should get used to, is just, you know, be vulnerable. There's no need to, everybody's on the same boat, so nobody's gonna judge you for that. So I thank you for that message. It's very applicable, and it rings true to me 100%. Yeah. So Jason, I mean, you know, we've been at it for over an hour. I love the conversation, but I mean, we have to say goodbye at some point. So before we say goodbye, what are your favorite network automation books?
Well, we have, first off, Mastering Python Networking by Mr.
the classic cover.
And then I'd say also the DevOps Handbook. I know you've been talking about the Phoenix Project, but and that's a good Audible book. But I'd say if you want a physical book to like thumb through, like, they have great diagrams, and they kind of distill down the principles of the Phoenix Project into chapters that are a little more organized. But I'd say that the overall impact of the Phoenix Project as a narrative still is very powerful. But as a reference book, this is more useful.
Yeah, but read the read the Phoenix project as well, because that's a
Yeah.
pretty good preset to the handbook.
Oh yeah, no, you read that first, and then I have this as a reference to refresh my memory, so I don't have to reread the whole thing.
You don't have to think about how that guy's the linchpin of everything. But anyways, go ahead.
And then the last one is network automation, programmability automation.
Perfect.
Mr. Edelman, Oswald, and the.
Yes, that's a great book too.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to be the tech reviewer for the first 50%, and they never call back, so I don't know what's going on, but apparently I offended somebody.
Oh, really?
That's definitely a great book. That's a book that I keep on my desk for reference as well. So thank you for all the recommendations. But the Phoenix project, that's a very enjoyable read, and it's almost like you read that book and you just want to say, I am that guy, and then I am that guy.
Yeah, and it's so evocative, in the emotional response, because I think for anybody who's been in operations or been around people in operations, you're just like, this. Yeah, there's that person who is always jumping into the fire and saving the day, and it's a good thing for that person and for the team. But then you're like, day after day, year after year, let's take a step back and try to improve the mental and physical health of that person who's having to take the brunt of all of our issues.
Yeah, if I remember, it was Brad, but I could be wrong. But so don't be Brad if that's.
No,
I mean, great for Brad, but he's he has to take a vacation at some point, and the company needs to run without him.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So Jason, thanks again. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for taking the time. I think it's going to be very useful for people, especially your advices. It's going to be useful for people who are new to NSO, but also for people who just want to get started on network automation. There's some good gems in there. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you for listening to a Network Automation Nerds podcast today. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other major podcast platforms. Until next time, bye-bye.